Welcome back to Season 3 of the 5G Guys. I'm Wayne Smith. I'm joined by my co-host, Dan McBall.
Hey, Wayne. Thanks, everyone, for joining us again. Excited to kick off our second episode of our third season. And today, for this episode, we've got our guest, Brian Daniels from Zayo. Brian's the Managing Director of Strategic Sales at Zayo, where he leads a team of their experts focused on long-haul fiber, global and low-latency networks, E-rate, and mobile infrastructure, which includes the foundation for 5G. Brian oversees strategy, operations, product development, implementation, and real estate options for Zayo. Included in this is fiber backhaul, front haul, as well as many turnkey implementations, including RF design, site acquisition, permitting, and installation of equipment. Prior to working at Zayo, Brian was a professional football player with the Minnesota Vikings. He went to the University of Colorado, where he got his BS in business, and then got an MBA from the University of Louisville. So, Brian, it's great to have you, and excited to learn about what Zayo's got going on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is exciting. This is officially my first podcast, so I'm super happy to be here.
Perfect. Well, let's kick it off. Thanks, Brian, for taking the time to speak with us. Before we dive in, can you give us a little background for the folks who don't know about Zayo and its history?
Yeah, it's funny. Most people that see our name say, who is Zayo, or some variation of, because we're not a super well-known household name like a CenturyLink or the old Level 3s, Sprint or Verizon. But we are the largest privately held fiber operator across U.S., Canada, and Western Europe. We were founded in 2007 and really born out of an ideology that there was a lot of overbuilt fiber assets out there. So at our core, kind of in the early years, was rolling up and aggregating a large fiber platform across the U.S., Canada, and then expanded into Europe. So, we've managed through 40 plus acquisitions in that time frame and created a very interesting platform of owned fiber assets that we use to service the mobile operators, the hyperscalers, and so forth. So our largest portion of our revenue actually comes from the lease and IRU, so long-term lease of fiber. So we're the underlying networks for a lot of the carriers that support your home internet, your wireless networks, and the big hyperscalers and the clouds out there.
So Brian, thanks for that overview. One of the things that Wayne and I've talked about in prior episodes, if you go back to episode 23, I think that was season 1 or 2, we did an episode called Wireless Needs Wires. And so, here we just kicked off the introduction to Zayo about being, fiber, and some people might be asking, well, what does it have to do with wireless? What does it have to do with 4G and 5G? So tell us, and I think that's a great segue into your role at Zayo, right?
Yeah, it really is. And I think Zayo was a very early innovator in this space. There was a small subset of customers as phones started to get upgraded from 3G to 4G, and the throughput needed at each macro tower increased. It was pretty innovative and leaned in, and we built a lot of fiber to the tower. So this was back in the 2015, 2016 timeframe is when that really accelerated. But there was a subset of customers or companies, really led by Zayo, that deployed a lot of new fiber infrastructure connected to these cell towers. That replaced a lot of copper connections that were out there and really created the infrastructure for 4G, then 5G to really take hold. And I think today it's commonplace to have a gig or higher type of connection at these towers, and sometimes 10 gig connectivity to the tower, as you see the implementation of C-band and everything that G has to offer.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you think about the time frame that you laid out from 2007 to today, and you're the largest privately held fiber provider. I mean, that's quite the accomplishment in the build out, because we all know in our industry, fiber is the long lead a lot of times in getting the site turned up. How did you guys pull that off? I mean, that's impressive.
It was a lot of hard work, and it was, and I think I can say this without getting myself in trouble, but it used to be a lot easier to build fiber networks, and we embarked on a lot of very big, multi-thousand route mile builds in a lot of big tier 1 markets: Denver, Atlanta, Dallas, Phoenix, Nashville. And those builds, they don't happen overnight. They take 2 years, 3 years sometimes. But it used to be a lot easier to go out and permit, put new fiber infrastructure in the ground. as the space is really consolidated and things continue to accelerate, it's become more difficult to build fiber in the ground. But I think there's still a subset of us that are pretty good at it. We've anchored just before COVID in 2019 the build out of all of Tampa and Orlando. So we built new fiber infrastructure supporting thousands of towers across both those markets. And that's a project that, like I said, got started just in 2019 and is really finishing up probably the middle of next year. So it can still be done. And I think it just takes a lot of dedication, a lot of resources, and you got to be very good at managing, that supply chain and those contractors to get the work done.
So we talked a little bit about some of the services Zayo offers, for example, long hauls. For listeners that don't quite know what that means, that's moving bits and bytes long distances across state lines, moving it from one coast to the other, things like that, right? Then we have, you move down the chain, mid haul. Okay, maybe we're moving things around the state, sort of like, state highways, if you will, to use some of my stupid analogies. And then I think the third piece that really got you guys into wireless was that last mile, right? Getting that last segment of connectivity to a cell site, to a tower, to a building that needs it, to tap into those mid-haul and long-haul networks. Is that an accurate assessment of how technology progressed for you guys?
Absolutely. At the core of our business was, call it that data center to data center. So those highways across the U.S. connecting markets, and then those highways within a market connecting data centers. And then off of that is really where the advent 4G, 5G, and then small cell led to a lot of densification. So, building out into areas off of those networks to hit, cell towers, small cells, enterprise businesses, all of that. It's exactly right.
Yeah. In the earlier days of deploying small cells for, the 3G to 4G transition, I remember talking to some folks deploying in Manhattan and New York City. A lot of this happens in the most dense cities first. And they tell these stories about how they'd have a cell site on a corner of, Fifth and Broadway that had hundreds, if not thousands of strands of fiber going by it, but they couldn't access any of that to actually serve that tower because it wasn't intended for that kind of local access. And I think that's some of the details that you guys get into that help solve this problem for the wireless industry and help advance 4G and 5G, right?
Yeah, I think building fiber infrastructure to macro towers and building that infrastructure is relatively easy. Small cell is a completely different game. And that is where things like how you access a network, how many pairs of fiber actually go to each small cell, and then where each one of those small cells gets front hauled to or from, the connectivity where that small cell needs to be connected, is very, very nuanced. And it's also very, very difficult. It's a big burden on your fiber backbone, the amount of fiber you have in the ground, and they're typically in hard places to reach. They're in the middle of the sidewalk, and they're particularly difficult to permit to build to, and they're not the typical points where you would drop connectivity. You drop connectivity in data centers and enterprise buildings for the most part. It's much more difficult to architect a network to deliver to a pole that's kind of freestanding in the middle of a street, middle of the sidewalk.
Hey, real quick, a quick word of thanks to today's sponsor, Vertex Innovations. For over 17 years, Vertex has been building the nation's wireless and broadband networks. Providing project management, network engineering, and construction oversight are just some of the ways Vertex helps their clients. So if you're looking for more of a partner to help you with your wireless network designs, construction, implementation, or operations, reach out to Vertex. You can find them at vertex-us.com. That's VERTEX-us.com. To remind listeners, when we talk macro cells, that's how cellular started. And, you might have a cell site that covers every mile to every 5 miles. That's sort of the density that we had originally. As we've progressed with 4G and 5G, we have sites every block in dense urban areas. And so you guys are trying to get fiber literally almost on every street corner, every other street corner in some of these cities. So it's got to be a challenge, but yet it speaks to where we're at as a technology when it regards not just wireless, but everything broadband telecom. So it's impressive. So tell us today where you feel things are as it relates to 4G wireless and the transition to 5G, specifically as it relates to your role in that progression in the technology.
Yeah, I would say, back to some of my earlier comments where there was a lot of fiber being delivered to the tower. Just after that, I would say that 2018, 2019 timeframe, we started to see a lot of small cell deployments, right? We started to see pretty dense small cell deployments, and typically we would call an RFP. So basically, one of the mobile operators saying, "Hey, I need this many small cells in a city," and they put it out to companies like Zayo to say, "Hey, can you go do this for us?" And we would look at that, and it was pretty daunting. They were very dense networks, just like you said. There was a site, every 300 feet, every 500 feet, so almost every corner of a city block, and they were big, big sticky networks. And from Zayo's perspective, we actually played pretty cautiously in that space. I think we realized early on that building turnkey small cells within markets is a hugely capital intensive, time intensive process. And just the way the network was architected itself, we were a little unsure whether it was going to lend value from an additional business perspective. We were a little unsure whether we could put 2 tenants on a small cell or even service more enterprise buildings off those networks. So we were pretty cautious, but I would say that wave really slowed down once some of this new spectrum came out to auction. And really where we are today is the densification of all that new spectrum out on those macro networks. So just like you said, those sites that are, anywhere from a mile to 5 miles apart, a lot of the connectivity and a lot of the focus, I think, with the mobile operators is deploying of that spectrum onto those macro towers. And for us, that means upgrading our backbones from those macro towers to, fiber or 10 gig. Now, I think, probably in another year or 2 years from now, somewhere in that time frame, we're going to see small cells come back as, that broader layer of spectrum from a macro perspective gets deployed, and there'll be another new wave of small cell. But I do think it's going to be a little bit more surgical, if you will. I think the cost, the time that it takes to go deploy a small cell is going to lend to, like I said, much more surgical applications, really high dense areas like in downtowns, in and around arenas or places where people congregate. I don't think it's going to be some of these broader type deployments that we saw early on, because there's all this additional spectrum layered on the macro layer to give people the 5G experience that they need. So I think from a Zayo perspective, we're kind of waiting for that next wave to happen while we go, do a ton of work just upgrading our cellular backhaul networks today to support everything that's being deployed now.
So then, as these small cell activities start picking up again, you talked about, your role the last time where a lot of it had to do with backhaul, but I think you also touched on something else that people might not know, which is that you guys also build small cells. You don't just bring the fiber to the small cells anymore. You're also playing an active role in building those sites as well, which is another layer in the process.
Yeah, we do. I think we own and operate about 5,000 small cells across the U.S. And for the listeners out there, put in kind of terms I think anybody can understand, that is a vertical piece of real estate, a pole that's stuck in the right of way. Sometimes it's wood, sometimes it's stealth and looks pretty like a street light. But our responsibility would be to acquire the real estate, to put the pole there, to bring power there, and to bring fiber there. So basically build all of the infrastructure between fiber, vertical real estate, and power that a mobile operator needs to hang radios and propagate a signal. So, it's still an interesting aspect or kind of area of business for us. But, we also went went private 2 years ago, and we belong in a portfolio of companies now with brother and sister companies that also do the same. So I think, go forward, a lot of where we're going to play in that space is probably going to be some competition amongst portfolio companies and really fine tuning and doing what we do really well and have them really do what they do well.
Okay, wait a minute. I got to check that. Did you say co-opetition?
I said co-opetition, which is maybe I coined that, but I think it's
great.
I think it's figuring out where you've got good core competencies and executing on that and understanding that someone may have a core competency that's a little bit better than yours and leveraging that.
I love it. I'm going to start using that one regularly.
Yeah.
First I have to find an opportunity to cooperate.
It's the fine art of co-opetition. Yes.
But it does bring up a really good point. Like when the companies come together, the different services of just, not just putting the infrastructure in, you have the data center piece of that, and then the network side of it. So you guys are really positioning yourselves not only for the mobile operators, but for enterprise who want private network type services.
Yeah. I think, in my role now, dealing with the big cloud players, the big carriers, mobile operators, and then, even in the vertical real estate space, I think, where our portfolio of companies sits is super interesting because you've got the clouds chasing enterprise and mobile networks, which need data centers, they need fiber, they need vertical real estate, they need all these pieces of infrastructure for all of this to work. And really focusing on what you do well and building an ecosystem of people around you that do other things well, I think is key. So we use this term a lot, at least on the digital bridge side of the house, convergence, right? There's a convergence of cloud, mobility, and networks that involves data centers and vertical real estate and fiber that I think is very, very interesting. And we've really only scratched the surface. And from Zayo's perspective, we play, really well in that fiber space, building out the fiber infrastructure, the low latency infrastructure, new fiber infrastructure to connect cloud to data center, enterprise to data center, enterprise to cloud, and mobile network to core into cloud. So, I'll use it again. There's a convergence of all that needs fiber.
So as you guys are doing the thing that you do in the marketplace right now, give us a sense for what are some of the long poles in the tent that, so to say, are the biggest hurdles in these deployments, and maybe where are some of the areas that you're seeing the most momentum where things are humming along?
Yeah, I would say where we have the most momentum is really in the areas that we can control. I think we've spent a tremendous amount of money upgrading our fiber infrastructure, deliver 10 gig to the tower, and make sure that the footprint that we have is quote unquote 5G ready. The things we can't control are some of the things I alluded to earlier that have just become, for one reason or another, more difficult. And that's really the construction of fiber. They're building a new school down the street from us, and our street's all ripped up. And I look at it and I'm like, well, when is this going to get done? It bothers me. There's dust, there's all these things. But when we build fiber networks, it's a lot of the same things. So, permitting, getting right away, franchise fees, right-of-way fees, all those things are becoming, more difficult to deal with, more costly, and the cost to construct is going up. So that puts pressure on a lot of these deployments. And I think from Zayo's perspective, we spend a good bit of time, money, and elbow grease just really understanding kind of where these cities and municipalities are at, talking to them about the value of fiber and what that infrastructure can do for businesses in the area, for enterprises in the area, for residentials in the area, and then working with them to help solve that problem, right? We want to do things in an aesthetically pleasing way. We want to manage and do traffic control really well. We want to be really courteous with our construction, but we want to go get it done. And we want to get it done in a means that meets the timelines for our customers. So those are a lot of the challenge that we work with kind of every day building that fiber infrastructure, is making sure that we're a good we're a good infrastructure provider in the places we live and work and operate our networks, and we're partnering with those cities to solve the problem, because it's not an easy problem. They've got people raising their hands, not wanting to have a small cell in front of their house or have their road ripped up for fiber, but we want to make sure that we're expressing what this infrastructure is going to do for their communities.
Yeah. How did supply chain affect you guys with the pandemic, and both in regard to hard capital assets like fiber optic cable, as well as the soft human capital side, workers? How did that impact you guys, and how do you see things going right now, and that being resolved?
As I look back at these last 2.5 years, it's pretty amazing, some of the things that we had to go through. We kicked off that project in Central Florida really right before, the onslaught of COVID. And once COVID hit, telecom is still an essential service. We still have to get out and operate our networks and make sure that there's connectivity and we're meeting the SLAs for our customers, because there's a lot of critical traffic that rides over these networks, mobile networks, 911 traffic, et cetera. But, we had issues like we couldn't find people to do locates in Florida. So we had to actually bring people into Florida to do locates, so we could go build the network and meet the timeframes for the customers. I would say now in the supply chain world, I think we're managing through it as best as anybody. We've pre-bought a tremendous amount of network equipment, so the optical equipment that's lighting the signal over our fiber. We continue to pre-buy a lot of fiber and conduit, those pieces that you need to go build networks. And I think we're starting to see, at least in a lot of our markets, the tightening of that human capital supply chain, the ability of people, to go work, coming down a little bit. But there's also a lot of work to be had. You got a tremendous amount of money being plumbed into the infrastructure space to do things like fiber to the home, along with 5G type deployments. So there is a lot of demand on these construction companies, the people that we subcontract and contract out work to. So, we're managing through that, I think, the best we can. And today, I think it's, we're in a pretty good spot.
That's definitely good to hear. I mean, in the industry, you hit a key term. You used the term lit fiber. Do you guys equally, dark and lit? I mean, what does that look like for you guys moving forward?
Yeah, I think, at the core, we're a telecommunications infrastructure company. So half of our revenue, like I said, is just dark fiber, where we're actually leasing someone fiber pair. But the other half is lit services, where, we're deploying the optical equipment on top of that, and we're supplying some other higher layer of service to a customer. And that'll always be our bread and butter. I think as we continue to expand our networks, like we talked about earlier, getting off of those freeways and interstates and more into dense urban areas and downtown CBD areas, we're going to continue to broaden that connectivity to more enterprises, more small cells, more towers, et cetera. And that could be a myriad of, dark fiber or some type of finished service that we offer to customers.
Acronym clarification, CBD means Central Business District. It does not mean the other, although I could see maybe some use cases coming out of the other definition.
Yeah, I am from Colorado, so I say CBD a lot, but I should probably correct myself. Yeah, Central Business District.
But it is a good segue into something you and I've talked about in the past, which is seeing what types of use cases. There's always been lots of promises. 3G to 4G, what's 4G going to really do for us? 4G to 5G, what's it really going to do for us? We've done lots of episodes on this topic. You guys are where the rubber meets the road. What kind of use cases are you actually seeing these days that are coming to fruition from the 5G deployments you're doing, and maybe what are some of the ones that aren't occurring yet, and why do you think that might be?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think if you think of like some of the core tenets of 5G, so increased throughput, ultra reliability, ultra low latency, ultra high connectivity, lots of connected devices. Where I see, the rubber hitting the road and their actual business cases coming through and people are making money is the throughput space. I think you've seen this with fixed wireless to the home. I mean, T-Mobile is putting a tremendous amount of subs and being very disruptive in this space at offering an at-home product off of their mobile network, right? So, that to me is a throughput scenario all the way that requires more connectivity to the tower, better spectrum to be able to offer that throughput to the home. As you get into some of the other niche things like ultra high reliability, ultra low latency, I think it's been a little bit hit and miss. Now, there are a subset of instances where I do think some of this is coming true. And I think for Zayo, we're seeing this as an interesting opportunity to start to mesh some of the terrestrial, what we call WAN, so wide area network services, with a wireless service, a private wireless service. So things like factories, we're looking at building connectivity and deploying a software layer and the infrastructure at the factory to build a wireless network, a private 5G or private LTE network that's tied to the land-based network that they're building. So we're doing this in the factory space. We're doing this in the retail space. And, some of that is just for increased throughput or to manage things like mobility. So within a factory where you've got a lot of connected devices moving around, they're starting to understand that Wi-Fi doesn't quite have the coverage that they need. So I think for us, that's where we see a lot of those early use cases for some of those other tenets of 5G start to prove out. Now, I think you're going to continue to see those develop. I think probably slower than a lot of people pontificated, but in that healthcare space, in, further down into the shipping yards, things like that. But I still think it's early there. So from Zayo's perspective, I think we're looking to really, one, make sure that we're well positioned to meet the needs of the mobile operators, right? To deliver high quality bandwidth or fiber to their macro towers and their small cells. And then for our enterprise customers, make sure that we're there with a fiber-based product and a capability to layer on the infrastructure on-premise to manage the wireless network. And once you tie that wireless network on-prem to that WAN network, it's pretty powerful because you can then control the SLAs for things like latency and jitter and all these other things without having to worry about offloading onto someone else's mobile network. And to me, that's a very interesting space for us as we start to develop kind of more and more, use cases with folks.
Yeah, our last episode, as a matter of fact, we had Jason Jennings from Mortensen Construction, and his focus for Mortensen is the entertainment and sport arena space, where and Wayne's company Vertex has played a role in this. We're deploying new distributed antenna systems at some of the new venues, like where the Raiders are playing in Las Vegas and like, and he touched on the fact that they are already starting to see some of these use cases around virtual reality, augmented reality, which that in and of itself starts requiring some of those low latency, super responsive networks that you're talking about. So I could see, that DAS is not going to be able to do what it needs to do if it doesn't have that low latency, high capacity fiber connection to facilitate it. So definitely starting to see some of that, eke its way into the network, and it'd be interesting to see how much more of it we see.
Yeah, I'm excited to see that. I'm excited to start to see, mobile edge compute, like actually putting some of the compute aspects of having to run those really true ultra low latency networks at the edge. And then, obviously, I've been to the Raiders' new stadium. I mean, these big sporting arenas, it's becoming a truly immersive type experience, whether you're on your phone, gambling, watching kind of real-time stat updates, or getting into things like, AR, VR type experiences at an arena. I mean, to me, that's going to be pretty exciting to watch. And as a fan, I'm excited to go kind of, enjoy that. I mean, I was amazed. I was at the Raiders Monday night game, their first Monday night game last year at their new stadium. And I remember sitting there, and there's family in front of me they must have had 5 children, and they were all watching and streaming. I knew they were streaming because they were selecting off Netflix, not downloaded things, but things that they were going to watch like off the Wi-Fi network at the stadium. And it's like, you've got an entire stadium of connected devices, and this family is able to keep their kids entertained watching Netflix the whole game. It was pretty interesting.
That's funny. Yeah, that's an expensive ticket to go sit and watch Netflix, I guess. But hey, family goes to the Raiders game together, stays together, right?
There you go. There you go.
Yeah, it's a good use case. So, what predictions? Next 3 to 5 years, what do you see in the industry? That's a tough one.
It is a tough one. I'm really interested to see kind of how much of the network core kind of evolves into the cloud. I mean, you've got Dish out there building their network core in the cloud, and we're working kind of hand in glove with them to build out that connectivity. But I'm really interested to see kind of where that lands in the U.S. with some of the big guys. And from a Zayo perspective, I think we're going to continue to partner with both the clouds and telcos to figure out how do you stand that infrastructure up to support the latency requirements needed to operate a mobile network that close, right? So from my perspective, I'm really interested to see that. I think the use cases for 5G and the monetization of things like ultra high reliability and low latency, I think that's probably going to play out toward the tail end of that 5 years. But I could be wrong. I just remember sitting in all those conferences pre-COVID where everybody's using all these 3-letter acronyms, and it's like, oh man, yeah, the future is here. But I think it takes a little longer. And I think these networks are hard to go deploy. They're expensive to go deploy. I think the mobile operators are sinking a ton of money into these networks, as are we. And there's kind of pockets of interesting use cases starting to develop. I just think they're going to take time before they're really fully developed. But it'll happen, and I think it'll just happen toward the tail end. And I think from Zayo's perspective, we want to make sure that we're network ready, that we're 5G ready, and that we stay on that innovative path with both the enterprises, the clouds, and the mobile operators.
One thought that came to mind, I probably should have asked it earlier, but what about rural broadband? You guys are out there everywhere. Are you taking part in some of the, those programs that the government released on rural broadband to the underserved?
Yeah, we are. I don't know that from Zayo's strategy perspective, we'll ever be out building dense fiber networks in rural America. But where I do know that we play is if you look at our networks, and we use that term long haul, building fiber between metros, we've got a strong desire to partner with states, cities, counties, and some of those funding buckets to ensure that the infrastructure that we have traversing those states, the new infrastructure that we build, is set up in a way that we can drop traffic in those rural areas, that we can enable wholesale access to internet rates in the middle of North Dakota, South Dakota, some of these areas, that the folks that are going to use those funds to build out networks to the home have access to that wholesale internet rates. And I think that's key to, one, ensuring that we continue to see parity or drive parity and what we call a price per gig, right? And the availability of that. So we are actively engaged in that and have a team really focused on making sure that where we're building fiber, we're going to enable access to that infrastructure to make sure that ecosystem has a place to grow and a place to go. So
that's good stuff. Listen, Brian, really appreciate your time. This is great to catch up with you, get the perspective of some of the folks that are actually making these networks happen. If we've got a listener that wants to learn more about how Zayo can help them or interacting with some of the projects you have going on, what's the best way? I mean, obviously Zayo.com, right? Be the website. Any other ways for people to connect with you?
Yeah, Zayo.com is the best place to get to know us, right? We've got an entire network there. We've got access to our team there, and it's definitely the best place to interface with all things Zayo. And we just refreshed it, so our marketing department would be happy that I dropped whatever you call it for our website, but it is a very innovative tool. We're very open with a lot of our network.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's been the case the whole time in my career, that a lot of network operators kind of hold tight behind their vest where their network actually resides and what they have. And Zayo's always been upfront. It's really easy to see where you guys have network, where you're deploying new network. So it's really a great resource to see where Zayo might be able to help someone.
Yeah. I think transparency is key. We want to build infrastructure to enable carriers, enterprises, mobile operators, everybody. That's our goal.
Perfect. Well, I think that's a wrap. I mean, I'll hand it back over to Dan. He does a good job of finishing. But thanks for the info. Super informative.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Sure. Really appreciate your time. I know you're busy, so taking time away to help educate our listeners is always appreciated. And until next time, for all our listeners, as always, reach out to us on 5gguys.com. Give us your feedback, questions, ideas for future episodes. Check out our blogs. We have some good information, acronym lists, things of that nature. So until next time, thank you for listening.
Take care.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for listening to the 5G Guys. For more resources and to connect with Dan and Wayne, check out their website at 5gguys.com. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit that follow button and share this episode with your friends and family.